the issues affecting Asia's animals and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Asia for Animals podcast. And my name is Ngoc and Nguyen. I'm the lead coordinator of the AFA Policy Coalitions based in Vietnam.
And I'm Jieh, Long coordinator for the AFA Disaster Resilience Coalition.
And today we are really excited to unpack the outcomes of the 20th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, or COP20, to the Conventions on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, which has just concluded in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And COP20 not only dealt with a record 114 agenda items and 50 listing proposals, it also marked the 50th anniversary of CITES and, as the CITES Secretary General put it, was expected to set the course for the convention for the next 50 years.
Over the past 2 weeks, Paris adopted 353 decisions, strengthened protections for more than 70 species of sharks and rays, and agreed on new safeguards for some endemic species, from geckos to sloths, that are particularly vulnerable to international trade in exotic pet markets.
That means, in practice, for wildlife trafficking networks, for Asian countries navigating the exotic pet trade, and for the wider One Health and zoonotic disease agenda. And we'll also look ahead at how advocacy might need to innovate, especially given CITES' growing governance, role, and workload. And to do that, we're joined by Dr. Mark Jones, a veterinarian and head of policy at the Born-Free Foundation, who has just come back from COP20 in Samarkand. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us so soon after the meeting.
Well, many thanks for inviting me, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Before we start, can I get you, Mark, to introduce yourself for the listener who may not know you yet? Tell us about your role at Born-Free Foundation and how long you've been involved in CITES and wildlife trade issues already.
Sure. So I'm from the UK and I trained as a veterinarian at Liverpool University back in the 1980s. And I have since also accumulated master's degrees in both aquatic and wild animal health. Before joining the NGO animal protection sector, I worked for many years in fish health and disease control, following which I spent 5 years traveling extensively and working on rescue and rehabilitation projects for primates, bears, birds, reptiles and others in South America and latterly in Asia, in Thailand. And during that time, I came to realize that most of the animals we were rescuing at these rescue centres were victims of wildlife trade. So I became very interested in the idea of trying to tackle wildlife trade and trafficking at source. We were dealing with the fallout from wildlife trade, which I began to realise is very, very extensive. But I got really interested in how you might tackle that trade at source in order to prevent the need for animals to be rescued. So I spent some time working in the NGO sector on policy work, and I joined the UK-based international wildlife charity Born-Free in 2014, where I currently manage a team focused on promoting the adoption of progressive legislation and policies worldwide concerning wildlife conservation, management and trade, and also the welfare of both free living and captive wild animals at international, national and local levels.
Wow, I can say that today we are in good hands. But let's start with a big milestone. So CITES recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. And how would you characterize the milestone and reflect on the evolution of CITES alongside the current state of wildlife trafficking networks in Asia? And you have just seen the COP20 up close. It's a meeting where parties work up a lot of agenda items, adopted numerous decisions, and review about 50 listing proposals. So I'm curious how you see this governance weight of CITES today compared to when you first started following it. So maybe you could also touch on how the nature of trafficking networks in Asia has changed in that time, the shift towards online trade, exotic pets, and complex supply chains that run through multiple transit hubs.
Yeah, well, I've been going to CITES meetings since around 2010. And during that time, I've seen some big changes, in particular to the way it's responding to the ever increasing number of species in dire need of protection from trade, and the ever increasing expectations for how the convention can effectively contribute to global efforts to tackle the crisis facing biodiversity. At a time when the nature of wildlife trade is changing and expanding very, very rapidly. So the meeting in Samarkand adopted unprecedented protections for over, as you mentioned, over 70 species of sharks and rays, including the uplisting of highly threatened species to Appendix 1, which means that international commercial trade in these species is now banned. And key beneficiaries include the oceanic white-tipped shark, manta and devil rays, and the iconic whale shark, the biggest fish that we have on the planet. And other marine species like wedgefish and giant guitarfish receive zero quota restrictions. That's suspension of wild-caught exports, while additional sharks are placed on Appendix 2, meaning trade in them will be subject to regulations aimed at ensuring it is both legal and sustainable going forward. The meeting also agreed new protections for many terrestrial species, species like the clappies and golden-bellied mangabeys, that's an endangered primate, both of which are found exclusively in Congo, were afforded maximum protection with Appendix 1 listings. 2 critically endangered species of African vulture were also uplisted to Appendix 1. Dorcas gazelles, striped hyenas, and two-toed sloths were listed on Appendix 2, as were African hornbills, which are threatened by the trade in their skulls and bills, which are used for ornaments. And when it comes to sort of Asian species, several species were listed. We've had a number of reptile species which are threatened by the global demand for exotic pets, including Galapagos iguanas, Ethiopian mountain adders, and Australian geckos, all winning new protections at the meeting. And the successful listing of these and other species on the appendices represents, I think, a critical lifeline for those species and a major step forward in efforts to protect them and halt their demise. On the other hand, some governments came to COP20 with the intention of reducing protections for iconic species in order to facilitate international trade, particularly trade in sort of high-value wildlife products. So Namibia proposed changes to the listing of its elephants and rhinos to allow it to trade in ivory and rhino horn. And several southern African countries attempted to remove the regulation of trade in their giraffe populations, while Canada and the United States tried to reduce the level of protection afforded to peregrine falcons. All these, what we would regard as very dangerous proposals, were heavily voted down at the meeting, which means that these species avoided potentially dire consequences. One of the things I think is interesting, and one of the things I've seen evolve in my time coming to CITES meetings, is that there has been an evolution in the way countries prepare for and vote at the meetings. Most of the world's countries, something like 184 countries parties to 184 countries are parties to CITES, which means that they commit to implementing the decisions and the rules and regulations that are adopted by CITES through their national legislation. So that's most of the world's countries, and it includes countries which are predominantly sources for wildlife products, transit countries for wildlife products, and of course end destinations for wildlife products. And one of the changes I've seen is the tendency for countries to start to look at these issues from a regional perspective rather than just a national perspective. So when I first started coming, countries would vote at CITES meetings individually. We've seen the EU become the European Union, which is 27 CITES parties, become a party to CITES in its own right in recent years, and the EU countries now vote. They make their decisions in advance of the meeting and vote as a bloc So they agree the way all 27 EU parties will vote at CITES meetings. And that big voting bloc now has a profound impact on the decisions that are made. And when we're lobbying countries these days to take particular positions or to vote a particular way, we end up being really focused on the EU, because without the support of the EU, it's actually quite difficult to get things done because they vote as a bloc. And we're seeing a similar trend among African countries now, where some African countries are pushing for the African Union to act as that regional body which would attempt to establish common positions among African countries for the proposals and documents that are considered at CITES meetings. So far, we haven't seen such an effort to develop a coordinated approach among Asian countries. And obviously there are many Asian countries that are parties to CITES. But that could be something that we see more of in the future. So it's something to look out for. And I think, just going back to the meeting itself, perhaps most disappointingly, before the COP began in Samarkand, we had a standing committee meeting the day before the COP started, and the standing committee meeting was mainly talking about some compliance issues, and that meeting opted to remove restrictions on the trade in live long-tailed macaques from breeding farms in Laos, PDR and Cambodia, allowing them to go back to supplying the huge demand for these widespread but endangered and fast disappearing Asian primates for biomedical testing, in spite of ongoing concerns about the use of these captive breeding facilities to launder wild-caught macaques into trade. We're very concerned that we're seeing a huge escalation in the trade in live animals, and the fact that those decisions are further facilitating that trade is a great worry for us going forward.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what is stopping the long-tailed macaques trade and imports into India from being regulated? And it seems like if there was a union in Asia, there will be more regulations in place.
That's certainly possible. And I think we have to distinguish the long-tailed macaque trade, which is largely supplied by captive breeding facilities in Southeast Asia, where the long-tailed macaque is found, is largely supplying animals into the sort of biomedical industry in the United States, Europe, Japan, some other countries. And that's a real concern. One, because as an organisation, we don't like the idea of any live animals, let alone live primates, being used for biomedical testing or product testing or safety testing. And we believe that there are much better non-animal alternative ways of conducting that testing that are available. So we'd like to see that use of animals phased out. And obviously we're concerned for the welfare of those animals that are bred in these huge captive breeding farms and transported halfway across the world to be used in laboratories. But there's also a conservation issue here, because long-tailed macaques, they're widespread. They have a very widespread home range across large parts of Asia. And so there's a perception that they're very common. But actually they're endangered and they're disappearing fast from large parts of their range. And part of the reason for that is because they are often regarded as a pest or a nuisance species, and in many countries progressive and humane ways of tackling that conflict between long-tailed macaques and people haven't really been implemented. So they are persecuted as a pest species, even though they're disappearing fast from many areas. And the offtake of animals from the wild in order to stop breeding farms as breeding stock, or in some cases to launder those animals through those breeding farms, because they're very valuable to the biomedical industry. And the demand for these animals went up markedly, particularly during the COVID pandemic, when there was a lot of research going on into COVID vaccines, and these were used as models for that research. That offtake from the wild is an additional threat to many of those fast disappearing wild populations. So we have a sort of three-pronged issue here. We have the issue that the use of long-term macaques isn't a particularly good model for biomedical research, and there are much better non-animal models available. We have the welfare issues associated with the breeding and taking from the wild and transport and use of these animals in laboratories. And we have the conservation issue associated with them being taken from the wild to stop breeding farms, either for direct laundering into trade or for use as breeding stock. So these are big issues, and we turn to CITES to try and tackle some of those issues, particularly around the offtake from the wild. CITES isn't a particularly welfare-focused convention, but it is focused on trying to ensure that the offtake of animals from the wild doesn't affect their conservation in the wild. So that's the angle that we're trying to approach with CITES, and we were very disappointed to see the restrictions on trade, particularly out of Laos, VDR and Cambodia, where there have been real concerns about how this trade is managed. The restrictions being lifted on those two countries so they can trade pretty freely from their breeding farms again. And we'll be pushing really hard to make sure that that trade is scrutinised to ensure that it's not adversely affecting wild populations. In India, since about 2022, I think just over 50,000 animals, according to customs data, have been recorded as being exported from all over the world, belonging to more than 2,000 species, to these facilities in Gujarat in India. And the facility owners, about a third of those animals are CITES listed species. About 2/3 are not CITES listed, but CITES listed, form a big part of those exports. So again, we were looking for CITES to scrutinise this huge trade, this massive facility that seems to have in excess of 50,000 live animals of all kinds of different species, and to make sure that all the rules that apply to international trade in CITES listed species are being strictly applied to any live trade to these facilities. The owners of the facilities claim that they are acting as rescue facilities, rescuing animals from dire conditions. However, some of the data that we're seeing suggests that some of these animals, and they include some critically endangered species like Tapanuli orangutan, gorillas from parts of Africa, and many, many others, that some of these animals appear to be being supplied by well-known wildlife traders. So we question the validity of some of those claims that the facilities are acting in the best interests of the animals themselves in terms of rescue. And they're also, if animals are in need of rescue, the best option for those animals should be legitimate rescue centres within their country, within where they are, where they're located, and where they belong, not halfway around the world in India. So there are real ongoing concerns about those facilities. We'll continue to try and scrutinise the facilities and ask the questions that need to be asked about the legitimacy of that trade. But it was disappointing to see the Standing Committee fail to impose stricter conditions on India's imports of live animals from all over the world.
Yeah, the lack of political will is frustrating.
So we heard that the parties agreed only to a modest 6.98% budget increase for 2026 to 2028. So what does that mean for how NGOs and governments in Asia need to support CITES in increasing its capacity and efficiency?
So while the 3 yearly conferences of the parties often focus on fine details of how the convention works, and of course the proposals for changes to listing new species or relisting species on different appendices, which gives them different levels of protection. The convention itself, I think, has come to a bit of a crossroads in this its 50th year. And at a time when we need CITES to be doing ever more to protect the ever-increasing number of species that are threatened by trade, funding for the convention's work is drying up to some extent, and many governments are failing to prioritise the implementation and enforcement of wildlife protections as they focus on other issues. During the second week in Samarkand, Born Free, with the organisation I work for, hosted an event to try and highlight some of these challenges and to consider possible solutions. And that event was moderated by our co-founder and executive president, Will Travers, and had representatives from the governments of Sri Lanka and Nigeria, and experts on wildlife trade, international wildlife law, and CITES itself, who participated in a really interesting panel discussion. Now, of course, we can't hope to solve the challenges that the convention faces in one lunchtime meeting at the COP, but it did give the 100 or so participants plenty of food for thought as to where the convention should focus and how it should operate, given the increasing pressure on the convention to do more and more to help resolve some of the issues that we face in this time of biodiversity crisis, but with what appears to be in real terms an ever diminishing budget for its secretariat, and often diminishing budgets at a national level that governments are applying to the implementation of these global rules on wildlife trade. There are different factions working at CITES and trying to influence its processes that have very different views on the direction it should take. Now, we on the animal protection side are very much on the protectionist side of these factions. We recognise that trade and trafficking is a massive contributor to wildlife decline, and that it already adversely impacts the welfare of literally millions of animals every year, which clearly has a negative effect on them. And it also, wildlife trade and trafficking can also increase the risk of emergence of diseases, for example, which can affect other animals and potentially people. So our view is we need to give wildlife greater protection all the time by regulating, and in many cases banning, international trade in wildlife and wildlife products. However, there are others who advocate at CITES that wildlife trade is critical to the lives and livelihoods of communities that live alongside wild animals, and that trade restrictions can be harmful to local and national economies. For me, it's vital that we recognise that for wildlife trade to benefit communities in the long term, it has to be ecologically sustainable, it has to be legal, it has to be safe, and it should always be humane. And I say that because, we recognise the importance of wildlife trade for many communities and people's livelihoods. But if it's not ecologically sustainable, it's not going to benefit them in the medium or long term, because those wildlife populations are going to diminish. So it's really, really important that CITES as an organisation and national governments in their implementation of CITES focus on protecting wildlife and ensuring that trade is ecologically sustainable, legal, safe and humane. So while CITES is clearly under pressure both in terms of its workload and its funding, CITES authorities have a really important role in efforts to meet the internationally agreed goals to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, put nature back on a path to recovery, and ensure that the use, harvesting and trade of wild species, as I've said, is sustainable, safe and legal by 2030. Now, that's an internationally agreed goal under another convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and CITES has a role here. CITES and national authorities must also play a critical part in reducing the risk of future disease emergence from traded wildlife. The next pandemic could occur at any time. We all perhaps are too quick to forget the huge impacts that COVID-19 had on our social lives, our economics, and of course the actual lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. That's not something that we want to see repeated, but if we don't want to see it repeated, we have to recognise that international wildlife trade carries big risks, and CITES must, as the international wildlife trade regulator, must have a role in reducing those risks which could result in future pandemics.
Yeah, it sounds like the digitalization of CITES permits and the tree monitoring system will help with the workload issue and improve the traceability and of the permit import and export, and so improve transparency, and it will help resolve the discrepancy between importing numbers and exporting numbers. Where are we now with the process of the transition of digitalization of the CITES system?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So-called e-permitting, which is the transition away from paper-based permitting systems, which can be very inefficient, can be, the subject of corruption and forgery and so on. And also result in huge discrepancies between the way things are reported by exporting and importing countries. And when you look at the CITES trade database, which is a publicly available trade database, which contains a lot of information on trade in CITES species, one, that database is often a year or two out of date, because it takes CITES parties a long time to provide the data from their paper systems in order to populate the database. So it's often out of date, and things can change rapidly over short periods of time. We're seeing the emergence of online systems of trading and the huge shifts in species that are being traded, particularly for things like the exotic pet trade, and those shifts can happen quickly. Trade changes often occur quickly, and if your database of information of what's happening is constantly a year or two or sometimes more out of date, and also is full of discrepancies and inaccuracies because different parties report that information in different ways, then that really doesn't help in terms of monitoring what's going on and being able to respond to changes. So the concept of e-permitting is really important. And at COP20, we held a side event, which I've mentioned already, on the future of CITES. And we had the head of Sri Lanka's CITES delegation give a short talk on the introduction of the e-permitting system that's been put in place to implement CITES requirements in his country, in Sri Lanka. So he talked about how they've done that. It's taken them a little while to put it in place, but they do now have it in place. And they've used it to replace the sort of inefficient, expensive and cumbersome and inaccurate paper systems that so many countries still operate under. So the introduction of effective e-permitting systems with, of course, appropriate security and tracking systems should enable real-time trafficking of CITES shipments and immediate transfer, or more or less immediate transfer, of data onto publicly available databases. And the use of, for example, QR codes should help improve verification processes at border crossings, simplifying the logistics and enforcement processes. Now, of course, there is an initial cost to introducing such systems, but over time, the efficiencies gained should enable those costs to be recuperated. And if everyone ends up using compatible systems, the tracking, tracing and verification of CITES shipments and the identification of illegal shipments should become much, much more efficient. So that whole process should, over time, increase the efficiency of data collection and the accuracy of that data and the consistency of that data across entire trade chains, and enable, for instance, enforcement authorities to step in very quickly when there are discrepancies to check whether transactions have transgressed CITES or national rules. So I think these systems are really important. We've got different countries at different stages of introducing these systems. As I say, Sri Lanka is one Asian country that has gone a long way down the road of introducing those systems, and we congratulate them on that. It's taken them a while, but they have got there, and they'd be an interesting model for other countries to look at. Of course, as we well know, no system is infallible, but we would really encourage Asian countries to look at what Sri Lanka and others have done and what they've introduced, and consider how such systems can be put in place across other countries, so that we can work towards a day when we have consistent, systems for monitoring and tracking and recording CITES transactions across the globe.
How can the Asian countries and NGOs advocates support that transition?
I think there are costs to introducing these systems, and the systems themselves obviously need to be examined, and the most appropriate system for the circumstance needs to be identified and put in place. I think, as I've already said, one really good way to do this is for countries to look at other countries that have already implemented such systems, and to look for where that's gone well, where they've had issues, where they've had problems, where they've had maybe teething problems with the system as they've introduced it, so that they can learn from those, the way that those systems have been introduced and implemented, and hopefully over time improve on them as well, so that we get a constant system of improvement. I think there should also be an onus on wealthier countries to contribute to the introduction of such systems, because many, so maybe you might call them Western countries or wealthier CITES parties, are part of trade chains which involve developing countries. So this is a generalization, obviously, but we see a lot of wildlife originating in parts of the developing world, in Latin America or Africa or Asia, and ending up in destinations in wealthier countries or more or developed parts of the world, in Europe or North America or wherever it is. And as I say, that is a generalization, because trade can take all kinds of different routes. So I think it is in the interests of consumer countries to look at helping source countries, and particularly source countries for products from endemic species, where those countries are struggling to protect their endemic species against unscrupulous trade in order to supply a lucrative demand in other parts of the world. I think there should be an onus on countries to be looking at helping, particularly developing countries, to introduce much more effective systems which will help them to monitor and to enforce the rules and regulations under CITES.
So now I think that we would like to zoom out from the technical side just a little bit. So some news report about CITES COP20 suggested that the conventions was getting a little bit overloaded, like we discussed. It's like a truck carrying too much, and that things need to be streamlined so it wouldn't break down, even though member countries agree to a small budget increase. So with all the new rules, protected species lists and committees, what are the best ways, in your opinion, we can change how we advocate, coming from the perspective of NGOs? And how can we make things simpler, cutting through the red tape and keeping our attentions on animals, nature, and people, instead of getting bogged down in paperwork? Now, we know that there's some positive signals already with the e-permits.
I mean, yes, CITES is 50 years old. It's full of flaws, and as someone who's been working at the convention for the last 15 or so years, and I'm sure colleagues in other NGOs that have been around CITES for a lot longer than I have would agree. We're always looking at those flaws and trying to identify where the gaps are, where the weaknesses are, and trying to fill them, and we'll continue to do that. But it is really, really important, the convention, because whilst it might be full of flaws and loopholes that we are concerned about, without this international mechanism, we'd be a lot worse off in terms of trying to regulate the international trade in wildlife. So it is really important, but it does need to evolve. The world is very different today than back in the early to mid 1970s, when CITES was first established. In some respects, I do think CITES needs to refocus on its core objective, which, just to remind everyone, is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten the survival of the species. In recent years, you could argue that it's become somewhat distracted particularly by the discussions around the economic impacts of CITES regulations and restrictions, and it needs to rein back and focus on what it is there to do to, protect species that are threatened by international trade. However, I would argue that its core objective shouldn't be limited to ensuring that trade does not threaten the survival of species. If we're genuinely going to tackle the crisis facing nature and biodiversity, species don't just need to survive. They need to thrive within functional ecosystems which can then deliver all the so-called ecosystem services that we all rely on: good food, clean air, clean water, resilience to climate change and extreme weather, and so on. So I think CITES does need to some extent to extend its scope in this regard, and to recognise that it has a vital role in helping to address the biodiversity crisis and meet the internationally agreed targets set out in the global biodiversity framework, which I've mentioned already, to ensure by 2030 that international trade in wildlife is ecologically sustainable, safe and legal. And we're a long way from achieving that goal at the moment. So, in some respects, it needs to focus on its core objective. But I would argue that within that core objective, it needs to be ever more ambitious. One of the things that we saw at the COP20 was quite a number of species having their status under CITES what's called uplisted from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1. Now, under Appendix 2 is there when species are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but could become so if international wildlife trade isn't regulated. Appendix 2 doesn't prevent international trade, but it requires it to be regulated by a system of permits, and they're designed to make sure that it's not detrimental to the species and that the specimens have been acquired legally in their country of origin. Whereas Appendix 1 is designed to ensure it is basically a de facto ban on international commercial trade in those species. So you could argue that an Appendix 2 listing is a way of trying to prevent the need for an Appendix 1 listing by regulating the trade to make sure that that trade remains sustainable and legal. And when you have a situation where you have a lot of species being proposed for uplisting from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1, and some of those species have been on Appendix 2 for a long time, that suggests that that system is failing, that those Appendix 2 listings are not preventing species continuing to decline and becoming ever more threatened by international trade. So eventually they have to go on Appendix 1. Which is a de facto ban on commercial international trade. So that's a real concern. And I think one of the ways that CITES should seek to evolve is in becoming bolder in the way that species are listed in the first place. Because we have to stop the situation where species get listed on CITES but continue to decline. CITES is supposed to be there to prevent that from happening. And when you see species being uplisted from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1, that system is clearly failing to work effectively. But this all requires ever greater resources for CITES itself, for its secretariat, but also at a national level, because at the end of the day, the implementation of CITES is the responsibility of individual member countries or parties through their own national regulation. So we always need much greater recognition of the crisis facing biodiversity, the importance of addressing that crisis as a priority for governments, and the need for them to invest properly in the implementation and enforcement of the rules around international wildlife trade if we're going to see CITES start to work a lot more effectively and be an effective way of preventing international trade threatening the very existence, or certainly the conservation status of increasing numbers of species.
Yeah, I want to bring up positive lists. What is a positive list, and does it help solving all of the problem that you have just mentioned about the classification system that is not working currently in CITES? And maybe it can also help with some of the workload issues.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. CITES, as the International Wildlife Trade Regulator, clearly has a role in regulating the trade in wild species that are in demand as exotic pets across the world. Many species are affected by live trade to supply pet markets, and many of those species are listed on CITES for that reason. And it's interesting to see that quite a number of the listings that were the listing proposals that were adopted at COP20 were for species that are threatened by the impacts of live trade for pet markets. Some of them are also affected by trade in other parts or products. But quite a number of species were listed for that reason, and they include striped hyena, two-toed sloths, songbirds, various reptile species, Australian geckos, Galapagos iguanas, Ethiopian mountain aggers, giant gollywasps, rattlesnakes, tortoises, hingeback tortoises, tarantulas. So quite a number of species are being listed for this reason. But as a tool for regulating the trade in exotic pets, CITES has real limitations. What it is, in effect, is a negative list, since it defines which species can't be traded internationally for commercial purposes, or which species require regulating. And of course, CITES is only concerned with international cross-border trade. It doesn't regulate trade, domestic trade at a national level. So it's a negative list system. It's a reactive system. And it's slow. It can take years for us to list a species and bring CITES requirements into play. Whereas, as we mentioned before, the exotic pet trade, the trends and the demands for different species in the exotic pet trade can change very, very quickly over a period of weeks or months. Many of the species affected by the exotic trade are not yet CITES listed. And CITES also is only focused on impacts at a population level. It's not really focused on animal welfare. It's not really focused on health. So while CITES provides a framework that regulates the trade in certain species traded for the exotic pet market, it has to be complemented by other regulatory tools if we're effectively going to address the risks associated with the exotic pet trade. And to that end, it's vital that CITES authorities work closely with other authorities at a national and international level, and they include authorities responsible for animal and human health, environmental protection, and law enforcement. Now, positive lists, on the other hand, they're a way of being much more proactive and precautionary in terms of what species can be traded for the exotic pet market. They're usually introduced at a national level rather than an international level, although there are some discussions, for example, within the European Union on whether there should be a regional positive list system put into place. So unlike CITES, which is a negative list system, it tells you what you can't do. Positive lists tell you what you can. And the idea is that in order to decide whether a species should get onto a positive list so that the trading and keeping of the species as an exotic pet can be allowed in a country, depends on whether that species meets certain criteria. And those kind of criteria can be conservation related. You know, does the trade affect populations in the wild where animals are being taken in order to supply the trade? They can be welfare related. Can you effectively keep the species and provide for its needs in a domestic setting? And what impacts does the actual trade itself have on welfare of that species if it's bred in captivity or held or transported over large distances or whatever? They can also be related to wider environmental concerns. What are the likelihood of a particular species either being released or escaping into the wild at its destination and establishing itself as what's called invasive alien species, which can cause all kinds of problems for native wildlife and native environments. Can that species be effectively traded without impacting the health and well-being of other animals and or people from a disease or from a health and safety perspective? So there are lots of criteria that you can apply, and there are a number of countries that operate positive lists, and those lists vary in terms of where their focus is. Some focus on preventing invasive species from becoming established. Some focus on animal welfare criteria. We would argue that all of these criteria are important and they should all be applied in a positive list approach. Positive lists have the advantage that they're precautionary. So if you don't have good information on which to base a judgment on a species, it doesn't get onto the positive list, and therefore it can't be traded or kept. And that's a precautionary approach, particularly when you, for instance, have new species identified, which can be of great interest to collectors if it's a new reptile species or something, and particularly if it's a very rare species. That can, the collection for pet trade. We've seen a number of examples of species being newly identified, and within months those species are appearing in trade as exotic pets, usually at very high prices because they're sought after, because they're rare. And a positive list could prevent that by saying, well, at least until we've had a chance to evaluate the species, you're not allowed to trade in it, rather than it being the other way around. So positive lists are precautionary. They operate at a national level. They can complement CITES in that they provide a way of introducing stricter measures at a national level, which may be designed, for instance, to protect endemic species in a particular country where CITES may not effectively do that. And they can also help to identify species through the positive list evaluation system, the conservation of which is threatened by the trade in that species as exotic pets. And that may inform future CITES listings. If countries start to say, we don't want to list these species on a positive list at a national level because we're concerned about the offtake in their country of origin, that should trigger concerns about the trade in the species and whether or not it should be CITES listed in the future. So CITES and positive lists can complement each other, but positive lists are very much more precautionary and progressive than CITES listings.
Yeah, thank you so much for the explanation, Mark, because I thought the positive list would have been used for replacing, like, overhaul of the entire CITES system. But I understand now it's to complement the existing system so that we can prioritize and focus on species that can be traded. And I suppose with that focus, it will allow us to ensure high standard, welfare standard for species that are allowed to be traded, right? Instead of like trying to understand every species welfare needs. We can focus on the ones that are allowed to be traded. So you have said already a few countries have already started implementing the positive list. How have they been doing? How is that working well? Do you think it will also work in Asia?
A number of countries have introduced positive lists, particularly in Europe, not exclusively in Europe. Canada also implements a positive list system. But we've seen developments in a number of European countries. I suppose the two best known are the Netherlands and Belgium, who've introduced positive lists. As I say, different countries introduce positive lists with different emphasis on what they're trying to achieve through them. But certainly the lists in Belgium and the Netherlands, which have been taxa specific to some extent. So, for instance, they might only apply to mammals at the moment, and they're seeing how those processes work before extending them to other taxa. They are quite complex to introduce in the first instance because you've got to sort of have a system of a number of criteria that you need to evaluate species against in order to decide whether they get onto a positive list or not. And you need to establish who it is that's going to make those evaluations and what kind of evidence they need to consider in making those evaluations. So it can take some time. You need to set up various different expert committees, independent expert committees that need to be charged with this. And the whole process of determining whether species should or should not be listed on a positive list can be quite complicated. And of course, we're not starting from scratch here, because in these countries, many, many, many different species are already kept as exotic pets. And the question is then, well, okay, if you introduce a positive list, what about all the animals that are already being kept by people in people's homes, many of which probably belong to species that won't get on to the positive list? What about those animals? So what some of the countries have done is introduce what you might call a grandfather clause, which says that if you already have these species that don't make it onto a positive list and therefore won't be able to be traded and kept going forward, you can still keep them, but you can't acquire more, and you can't breed from them. So in other words, they would remain in captivity for the rest of their lives. In some cases, people might want to relinquish those animals, and we would encourage them to, if that's what they want to do, to obviously do that through reputable rescue centres where they're available, who can provide the best advice and care for those animals going forward. It is complicated, but my understanding from some of the evidence that's been accumulated, particularly in countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, is that what they've seen is a big reduction in the trade in species that are not listed on the positive list after positive lists are introduced. So that's what the lists are there to do. They're there to restrict the number of species that can be traded to those species that can be traded without adversely affecting their welfare or their conservation status or threatening public or environmental health and safety. So in that sense, it looks as if those positive list systems are working well. Other countries are considering them. Some countries that have already introduced them for some taxa, for some purposes, may be considering expanding them to other taxa. So we would certainly be, with the huge increase in interest in exotic pets all around the world that we're seeing, and that's a real concern. We would very much encourage Asian countries to look at what's happening elsewhere. And again, a little bit like we said before with e-permitting, have a look at the countries that have already started to introduce these lists, and have a look at the systems they've introduced, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, so that over time, as more countries take an interest in this issue, we can hopefully develop model positive list systems which better protect our wildlife.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think we have covered so many things in the past hours. And I think that at this stage, we would like to dive a little bit deeper into the exotic pets and corporations. So our next question is, which international bodies, in your opinion, should CITES connect more closely and effectively with to regulate exotic pet trade? And what national policy reforms would you advocate for in the Asian context? So, for example, COP20 updated resolutions on cooperations with other biodiversity-related conventions and cooperations with the conventions on biological diversities, global strategies for plant conservations, encouraging parties to strengthen coordinations between national focal points and to build capacity across conventions. So do you think there are specific international bodies, whether that's the Quadripartite Collaborations for One Health, the World Organizations for Animal Health, the International Air Transportation Associations, or others, that CITES should be working much more closely with to tackle exotic pet trade that flows into and within Asia?
Yeah, so we have quite a number of different international bodies and conventions of one kind or another that are designed to deal with different aspects of wildlife and biodiversity and human and animal health. And to an extent, and I think you could apply this criticism at all kinds of levels, at national government level, at international level. We've always been guilty of these bodies working in silos, sort of, doing different but related things, but working separately from each other. And I think we're trying to realize, we're beginning to realize how important it is that these organizations collaborate and work effectively together. And I think perhaps one of the areas where this is most where this is best articulated is in the development of One Health approaches to wildlife and our relationship with wildlife and biodiversity, because One Health talks about the interrelationship between animal, human and environmental health, and how we need the authorities that work on those different areas and the experts that work on these different areas to be working collaboratively, because we're, animal health and human health and environmental health all affect each other. So from the perspective of wildlife trade and the trade in exotic pets in particular, this crosses over into the One Health arena, because wildlife trade can certainly affect the health and well-being of animals that are traded, particularly those that are traded live. And if you adversely affect the health and welfare of traded animals, then it's much more likely that those animals are going to get sick, and that they're going to, that pathogens, viruses, or whatever might be expressed, and they might spill over to other animals and potentially to people. So again, you've got that interconnection between the exotic pet trade and the whole One Health agenda. So all these things are interconnected. So yes, we need to see much greater integration of the work of the likes of CITES with some of the other bodies at international and national levels, and a recognition that CITES doesn't work in isolation or can't work in isolation. As the International Wildlife Trade Regulator, it has a responsibility alongside others to ensure that wildlife trade not only doesn't deplete populations, but that it also doesn't adversely affect the welfare of animals in trade, and therefore increase the risk of spillover of pathogens and so on, which can affect other animals and people. So CITES does already have some MOUs, some agreements to work closely with some other international bodies like the World Organization for Animal Health, for example. It adopts the International Air Transport Regulations from IATA, and it adapts those for non-air transport purposes in the guidance that's given to CITES parties on the non-air transport of live animals, for example. And we need to see those relationships deepen. But I've already mentioned the goals and targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And again, CITES has some pretty direct responsibilities in relation to achieving those goals and targets of making sure that wildlife trade is sustainable, legal and safe. So we need to see greater integration between CITES at an international level and the Convention on Biological Diversity in the fulfillment of the international agreements on goals and targets for biodiversity, for reducing nature and biodiversity loss and restoring nature and biodiversity over time. And we have some very clearly defined goals and targets and timelines for that to happen. Unfortunately, we're not seeing enough effort in that regard to have real confidence that those timelines are going to be met. So we need much more effort. So this needs to happen at an international level through the conventions, through the secretariats of those conventions working in close collaboration. The Convention on Migratory Species is also important in this regard, and CITES already works quite closely with the Convention on Migratory Species on a number of issues. We also need to see it happen at a national level. That's really, really important, because that's where CITES and all these other conventions are effectively implemented at a national level through national legislation and policy. So we need to see greater collaboration between the CITES focal points and the focal points that relate to animal health, the focal points that relate to human health as well. The World Health Organization focal points. We have the pandemics agreement, which has been agreed. It's yet to be signed and ratified by the World Health Organization. And in that pandemics agreement, there's quite a big focus on implementing One Health principles and addressing pandemics at source, so that you're preventing the situation where it's likely that pandemic causing organisms will emerge in the first place. And wildlife trade, international wildlife trade, carries a big risk of transfer, emergence and transfer of pathogens, some of which could have pandemic potential. So CITES focal points need to be working in close collaboration with their counterparts who are responsible for human health as well as animal health. All of these things need to be much better integrated. We need to get away from working in silos and towards working in a situation where the responsibilities of each of these agencies are clearly defined, but that they understand where they fit in the overarching aims and goals that society has created for halting and reversing the decline in wildlife and biodiversity globally.
That is super interesting, and you've actually covered some of the questions that we've come up with on this topic. So actually, just to follow up, do you think that the decisions from COP20 give advocates enough leverage to push for stronger One Health-oriented reforms at the national level, or is that something where civil society will really need to push beyond what's written in the decisions themselves?
So, that's an interesting question. With regards to One Health, there were two documents under the agenda item on the role of CITES in reducing the risk of future zoonotic disease emergence associated with the international wildlife trade that were considered at COP20. One from the Standing Committee proposing a number of time-bound decisions, and one from the government of Senegal proposing the adoption of a resolution on CITES and One Health. And we helped coordinate a side event very early in the meeting, supporting Senegal's proposal alongside Wildlife Conservation Society and the governments of Senegal and Liberia, which was well attended. Now, unfortunately, the meeting decided against adopting the resolution and instead adopted some amended version of the decisions proposed by the Standing Committee. Now, those decisions aren't bad. They place some responsibility on the Secretariat, the CITES Secretariat, the Standing Committee, and to parties and the technical committees, particularly the Animals Committee. To, for example, work closely with IATA, provide input on CITES-related issues to guidelines by relevant organisations like the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations Environment Programme, the World Health Organization, and so on. And for parties and the committees to report back to the Standing Committee, which will then review progress towards implementing a sort of One Health approach through CITES and make further recommendations to the next COP in 3 years' time, which will take place in Panama in 2028, I believe. And that might include a new draft resolution on One Health. So while we were disappointed that the resolution, which would really have embedded this system sort of on a permanent basis within CITES, because resolutions are not time-bound, they're open-ended, we were disappointed that resolution wasn't adopted. Nevertheless, we do have some positive decisions that have come out of this COP that we can work with over the next 3 years and work towards a situation where CITES responsibilities in terms of implementing a One Health approach in order to do all the things that we talked about reducing risk of spillover of disease from wildlife trade, international wildlife trade, and where CITES responsibilities lie within that, we can hopefully move forward in that regard. And a big part of that will be encouraging greater cooperation that we've talked about already at an international and national level.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think that has covered a lot of what we would like to ask for today. It has been a super interesting insight for our audience, who are mostly from civil society like us. And we got one final question, well, in the interest of time. And I think that question is super interesting for our colleagues working in rescue and sanctuaries. So I think Cole would like to ask these questions.
So this final question is related to the discussion we had in the beginning of the podcast, and it's about it's about the import of animals in the trends in traffic, animals being trafficked from all over the world into India. So what I'm observing is that there's this dilemma between repatriation and animal welfare. We do want range countries to be able to get back the animals that have been trafficked to non-native countries like India, but range countries often face problems like capacity issues. There's not enough infrastructure, and where do the animals even come from? Do we have resources for genetic tests to determine where the origin of the animals? So while we are advocating for repatriation, how can we ensure the welfare of these animals that have been trafficked and repatriated can be met? Like what is CITES' role in ensuring that non-native countries don't hog the species that have been trafficked into their country, and the range countries have the capacity in ensuring animals have good welfare standards and following best practice guidelines in rehabilitation and release of the animals back into the wild after they have been repatriated?
Yeah, so this is a huge question, a very interesting question. The management of live animals when they're confiscated from trade because they're being traded illegally or whatever is a hugely important issue from the perspective of ensuring the welfare of the animals involved, but also because seized animals, and bear in mind, if these are CITES listed species, they've already been, by virtue of their listing, it's already been decided that they're threatened or that they could become threatened through international trade. So these are usually species that are already classified as near threatened or endangered, in danger of extinction. So those animals that are seized may also be really important from a conservation perspective, particularly if they originate from highly threatened species or populations. Now, in an ideal world, confiscated live animals should be repatriated to their country of origin so they can be rehabilitated and returned to the wild in their native habitat where they truly belong. But this isn't always or even often possible for all kinds of reasons. The animals may not be in good physical health and may require extensive veterinary care at the point of confiscation in order to enable them to survive and restore them to health. And they may also be psychologically damaged by their experiences, which might make them behaviorally unsuitable for rehabilitation or release. And through their experiences, they may have encountered or developed diseases which could put their wild conspecifics at risk if they're repatriated for release back into the wild. And, as you've alluded to, their country of origin, first of all, their country of origin may not be the source country for the trade transaction. They may have gone through a transit country. They may be from a captive breeding operation, which may render them completely unsuitable for repatriation and return to the wild. And the country of origin may well not be equipped to take them back. The return journey may be very detrimental to their health, and even if repatriated and released, they may be at high risk of being recaptured and end up back in the trade. So there's all kinds of things to consider here, and it's complicated, and CITES has a whole work stream on what they call disposal of confiscated specimens. It covers wild animals but also parts and products from animals. It's a bit of an unfortunate name. We don't really like the term disposal when it comes to live animals. But what it's really talking about is managing confiscated wildlife, whether that's live animals or parts and products derived from animals. And as I've said already, CITES isn't by any stretch an animal welfare focused convention. Nevertheless, it does set out some very useful and important guidance into how enforcement authorities should manage animals that they confiscate. And some important improvements to this guidance were agreed at COP20. I think it's vital that at the point of confiscation, the confiscating authorities should be able to access expert advice in order to correctly identify the species that they have for a start. And that may not always be easy. And how those species should be handled in the immediate aftermath of confiscation, because that's going to be critical in determining how successfully those animals can then be either repatriated or moved to a suitable rescue facility, and how they're likely to fare when they get there. A network of rescue centres has been proposed at CITES, having a sort of directory of rescue centres which specialise in particular species, which would then give authorities access to information on where they might be able to seek advice, or possibly even to place the animals so that they can be given species-specific and species-appropriate care. And then following that, decisions can be made for the appropriate long-term placement of those animals. Now, as I've said, ideally that should be in their country of origin, but where that's not possible, it might have to be a facility in another country, probably the confiscating country, where they can be taken care of. And Born Free isn't an advocate of zoos, commercial zoos, but in many countries, those are the only facilities that have anything close to the capacity or the capability of looking after some of the animals that might be confiscated through trade. So they inevitably have a part to play, although we would much rather focus on legitimate rescue centres and sanctuaries, where those exist. But as we know, in many countries they may not exist, or where they do exist, they may not have the capacity or the capability of looking after particular species with particular needs. So it is very complicated. We're very much advocating for not only a directory of rescue centres, and we encourage countries to have very clear definitions of what constitutes a rescue centre, what rescue centres should and shouldn't be there to do, and, where possible, to register those rescue centres so that we know that the rescue centres on the register operate to particular standards and particular ethical principles, and that we're not simply returning confiscated animals into commercial trade in some way. So that's really important. But we also advocate for there to be international and easily available directories of species-specific experts who can give authorities advice on how to deal with animals when they first encounter them, in order to protect themselves and also to protect the health and welfare of the animals concerned, and where they can go to seek further advice on where the animals should be suitably placed. But we're a very, very long way from having any kind of ideal system in this regard. And unfortunately, what that means is that when animals are traded and confiscated for one reason or another, many of them end up dying or not being able to be placed in somewhere that's suitable to look after them. In many cases, they can't be repatriated for one reason, for some of the reasons that we pointed out. So there's a lot of work to do in that regard, and we're very keen to work with others across Asia and elsewhere to move towards a system where, at the very least, people have good information on where they can go for the best advice.
I agree with you that we need a network among the rescue centers, especially in Asia. We need to build that capacity and capabilities in rich countries for rescue centers to be able to take care of these animals that have been confiscated, that have been repatriated, so that people cannot say that zoos can provide better welfare, so the animals should go to zoos, and they should go to rescue centers and to be rehabilitated and then potentially be released. So the information sharing network and the capacity building and experience sharing is one of the things that AFA Sanctuaries and Rescue Centers Coalition is facilitating. So we encourage rescue centers in Asia to engage with the AFA SOC network and see how we can better collectively work together to ensure animals don't end up in the wrong hand, and that they have a chance to go back to where they truly belong.
Yeah, so Mark, thank you so much for sharing your reflections, and it has been very insightful. And on CITES 50 years and the outcomes of the recent COP20 and the road ahead, from zoonotic risks and One Health to exotic pets, electronic system, and repatriations. And we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us after such an intense meeting recently. And we hope this conversation help our listeners, especially in Asia, to navigate what these decisions might mean for their own advocacy. Mark, do you want to say the final goodbye to the audience?
Yeah, so no, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, as always. And we're always really keen to be working closely. We have at the CITES level, we're part of what's called Species Survival Network, which is a network of global organizations. Many in Asia will be Asia for Animals members as well that work on CITES issues. And it's really good to see the Asia for Animals network being more interested and involved in these issues, because wildlife trade and trafficking is a huge issue in Asia as it is across the world. The CITES COP20 was very interesting. We had some very positive outcomes, but it has huge challenges going forward, and we need CITES to evolve and to become much more collaborative with other conventions and other international processes if we're really going to emerge over the coming years in a better situation for our wildlife than we're in at the moment.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for listening in. We will link the key outcomes and summaries from the CITES COP20's meeting in the show notes, so you can explore further details yourself, and stay tuned for more exciting episodes in the future. This is Ko
and Ngoc, signing off from the Asia for Animals podcast. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.